What would you call this creature? Most of us might say the Medusa. Some of us might even say the Gorgon. How about this? A head, bearded, scary, boar-like fangs. And this, a centaur-like body. Would you still call her Medusa? You see, we expect that what we call Medusa to look and behave a certain way. A woman who was cursed to have snakes for hair may be a snake lower body as well. A woman whose gaze turns anyone into stone. It's easy to think that it must have been a pretty stable mythological creature in its form and storytelling. I certainly thought of the same. My first encounter with the Medusa was from the 2011 movie Clash of the Titans. Perseus slaying a slithering, snake-like female monster who has a degree of tragedy sewn into her face and expressions. I remember thinking, wow, she must be very ancient. But apparently, this image isn't that ancient. In fact, it hasn't even been around for that long. Today, we are here to find out how we got here. Let's go back to the ancient times. What you are seeing now is a Boeotian vase from the 7th century BC. It shows the Gorgon completely unlike the one we are familiar with. At this point, Medusa did not exist. Instead, we have this creature with a centaur-like body and the absence of any snake hair. The way we knew that this has anything to do with Medusa is how the person slaying her is doing it while looking away, indicating that this is the famous Perseus slaying the Gorgon, and he's looking away as to not be turned to stone. A little later after this depiction, the first literary references to the Gorgon began to appear in Greek epic poetry. In Homer's Iliad, Homer describes the Gorgon's head as something so dreadful that it is placed on Athena's aegis, her shield or armor, as a symbol meant to terrify enemies. She threw her tasseled aegis about, her shoulders wreathed around with rout as with a fringe, and on it were strife and strength, and panic whose blood runs cold. Moreover, there was the head of the dread monster Gorgon, grim and awful to behold, portent of aegis-bearing Zeus. Grim and awful. This view of Gorgons being scary wasn't limited to stories and special items. It was also integrated into architecture and everyday objects. If we take a look at archaeology, we start to see these dreadful and monstrous Gorgon visage everywhere, under drinking cups, on doorways, painted on shields, particularly because one of the most prominent functions of a Gorgon image at this time is for warding off evil. We even have a name for it, the Gorgoneon. The beards, the fangs, scary wings, large bulging eyes, the ferocity and awfulness of these Gorgon faces are directly tied to this anti-bad luck function. The scarier it is, the better it works. Why? Well, scary imagery, such as distorted faces used to ward off evil, was common across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East during this era, and these traditions likely influenced one another. Greek art during the 8th century BC was going through an event called the Orientalizing era, where influences from the Near East and Egypt were going into the islands. This era gave the Greeks so many visual seeds for what we would consider as Greek mythological beings like the griffin and the sirens. Greek artists may have drawn on nearby Mesopotamian examples such as the Humbaba mask, as well as Egyptian symbolism for the protective power such as Uraeus. From these exchanges, the Gorgons acquired their visual traits: the serpent hair, power to turn people to stone, wings, and scary faces. At this point, however, the Gorgons didn't have a name. There was no Medusa. This would all change when Hesiod in the 7th century BC expanded the story of the Gorgons. Hesiod turned them into 3 siblings: Steno, Euryale, and Medusa, with Medusa being the only mortal one, as well as our focus in this discussion. But at this point, she was still scary. Carvings show her with wings, running and grinning with these large tusks and wide bulging eyes. Stories tell how her nails are made of bronze. The emphasis was still pretty much on Medusa as a monster. The portrayal of her as a tragic cursed woman was non-existent during the 8th to 6th century BC. she was still just a creature to be slain by Perseus. This would only change in the 4th century BC. This is a terracotta jar dated to around 450 to 440 BC and is attributed to Polygnotos. This jar depicts the ubiquitous scene of Perseus slaying Medusa, except Medusa here looks much more human. The monstrous face is not there. We have instead a sleeping woman, seemingly harmless. This is the first known instance of a so-called maiden-like Medusa. We do not know why this shift occurred. What we do know is that it gave a precedent for sympathy. You see, the more we humanize a monster, the more we relate to it, which in turn causes us to humanize the monster even more, creating this cycle of increasing familiarity. Such human portrayal, though uncommon, would persist alongside the more monster-like figure throughout antiquity. By the Roman Empire, mosaics of Medusa are almost exclusively human and effeminate in features. Perception of the Medusa had shifted to that of sympathy. This would provide the base for her next transformation. Her story would undergo an immense change. In the year 880, Publius Ovidius Naso, better known as Ovid, a Roman poet, finished writing the epic poem Metamorphoses, a retelling of stories from Greek and Roman mythology. And in it he mentions how the Medusa came to be. They say that Neptune, lord of the seas, violated her in the temple of Minerva. Jupiter's daughter turned away and hid her eyes behind her aegis. So that it might not go unpunished, she changed the Gorgon's hair to foul snakes. Here we have our infamous Medusa story. She is once a beautiful priestess. Her beauty caught the eyes of Neptune, or Poseidon, who forced himself on Medusa within the temple of Minerva, or Athena. Minerva, seeing this as a slight, then cursed her by transforming her hair into snakes and making her gaze lethal. This is the turning point for the imagination of Medusa. Earlier traditions mostly treat her as a dangerous creature to be slain. Ovid changed the emphasis by explaining how she became that creature in the first place. Once the myth is framed around violation and punishment, Medusa stops being only a monster and becomes a transformed person with a recognizable emotional story. This shift in tone is what made Ovid's version so influential in later art and literature. Artists were no longer depicting only terror or defeat, they were depicting suffering and the tension between beauty and monstrosity, which is why later audiences could read Medusa as someone tragic. As the world shifts from antiquity to the medieval period, the Medusa and Gorgons took a backseat. In the era of bestiaries filled with fantastical beasts and monsters, the Medusa is only one in a plethora of creatures serving mostly one role, as Christian moral allegory. Even then, she only appeared occasionally, and her popularity is overtaken by the likes of the griffin, the sirens, and killer rabbits. However, Medusa would soon have her own revival. During the Renaissance was an era of renewed interest towards everything antiquity related. Art, fashion, literature all became popular again. One of the most studied antiquity-era literature were the Metamorphoses. Inevitably, the Medusa would find her way back to the popular mind. In Florence, Benvenuto Cellini's Perseus with the head of Medusa turns the myth into a public display of power, with a very human-looking Medusa. Caravaggio's head of Medusa, painted on a shield, captures the moment of beheading, bringing the myth to the most confrontational and visceral depiction. Then, in the Baroque period, Bernini's Medusa shifts the focus even more inward, emphasizing Medusa's own torment. Across these works, we can see the shift. Medusa is no longer just a monster that Perseus slew, but a storied character of her own that can exist individually from Perseus. Which brings us to thee. It lieth, gazing on the midnight sky, upon the cloudy mountain peaks supine. Below, far lands are seen tremblingly. Its horror and its beauty are divine. As we move into the 19th century and beyond, Medusa began to be read with increasing duality, particularly through the lens of Ovid's story. Scholars and artists emphasize this dimension, reframing her less as an embodiment of terror and more as a figure shaped by injustice. This interpretive shift becomes especially influential in Victorian depictions, where Medusa is often understood as a symbol of duality, of both tragic beauty and monstrosity. Here is Arnold Böcklin's Medusa, portrayed in a sad expression, lamenting her own suffering. Then there is Dante Gabriel Rossetti's Aspecta Medusa, where the painting shows her before being cursed, the completely human side of Medusa with golden hair. Even the Percy Bysshe Shelley poetry that I showed earlier mentioned this duality again and again. At this point, Medusa has a rich 3,000-year-old history of interpretation, and all of it would culminate very soon in the modern era. The world was exciting. Development, easier access to information, rapid industrialization, trends going in and out, and most importantly, cinema was booming. The recent releases of Star Wars meant that people were going to the movies each time a big new fiction or fantasy flick was up. And in this year, a movie called Clash of the Titans released, an action-filled epic retelling of the adventures of Perseus, made for the early 80s audience. It featured legendary monsters animated in stop motion by the monster flick animator Ray Harryhausen. And in the movie, we see none other than Medusa, somewhat harkening back to the monstrosity of the Gorgon, albeit with modern ideas. Here, she is clearly portrayed as a woman who is also monstrous. The completely new concept of that snake-like body, the absence of wings, the monster-like grunts, alongside the occasional human scream. It took inspiration from both the monstrous side of her and the human side of her. This would ultimately shape our popular perception of what Medusa looks like. And now, we have our Medusa. Whether in archaic Greece or in Pinterest, one thing remains consistent. Medusa never stays consistent in meaning or form. Across thousands of years, she has shifted between monster and victim, warning and protector, object of fear and symbol of resistance. Each era reshapes her according to its own anxieties, values, and imagination, which is precisely why her image continues to survive so prominently. The fact that she can exist simultaneously as a terrifying ancient emblem and a deeply human figure is what makes her one of the most enduring and memorable characters to emerge from classical mythology.